Welcome to Ground Control and another episode of the Pilot's Lounge. I wanted to talk about a couple of my favorite factory planes so far that I've flown, and one of them is this fun Cub 1100. The motor that I have in it, the motor that I'm going to stick with and prop is the Racer Star BR 2212 1400 kV motor and the APC 10x3 Sport composite two-blade prop, and I'm running an old 1300mm 3S 40C lipo in it, one of the first lipos I ever purchased, so they're old and they're tired, but I still get plenty of power from this power system. This plane can actually, with this power system, this plane can actually pull vertical and ascend. Not quickly, but it can pull it vertical. And let me see, on the bench, this motor and prop produced 1,210 grams of thrust. And flying through the air, I don't think it should be pulling more than about 14, 15 amps at full throttle. Flying through the air, it also has very good 50% thrust on this. My all-up weight on this plane with a little heavier prop is 685 grams, so I'm still under 700 grams of weight, 1,210 grams of thrust. That is awesome. So the prop is not a budget prop, in my opinion. The servos are Racer Star 12 gram digital Metal Gear servos, all four of them. I wanted to make sure that I had torquey servos in this plane because I knew I was going to want to perform aerobatics with it. This plane's slow flight capability is awesome, and I don't even have the flaps installed in it yet. I may have already posted the test flights with this new power system, and after I got this plane all trimmed out and got the control surface movement exactly the way I wanted it, to fly. If not, those will be coming up very soon. But this is such a fun plane, and my plug-and fly cost with everything that's in it right now, less the receiver, less the lipo, is $112.75. And I will guarantee you I'm going to get a lot more than $112.75 of fun out of this plane. So next I'll be putting in the flaps. We're going to turn it into a complete STOL aircraft. So looking at how slowly you can fly it right now, I can only imagine what it's going to be like with flaps deployed. But this is definitely one of my favorite all-time factory planes that I have flown so far. It's very stable, excellent slow flight capability. It's very forgiving, and if you put the right power system in it, it's also very aerobatic. So look for a lot more flights on the Fun Cub 1100. I will have links in the show notes to the playlist for this. In those show notes, you will find links to all the components that I put in this plane, plus a link to the kit itself. So if you're looking for a fairly inexpensive plane with great slow flight capability that's also aerobatic, $112.75 is a pretty darn good value for what you get with this plane. Okay, so next up. Okay, so the Volantex Ranger G2, which is I think a 1.2 meter wingspan. I think this may be the largest plane that I have in my inventory, but this is another plane that's just a great flying plane. Now, I had a problem with mine. From what I understand, what people are telling me is that when I purchased mine, it had a very bad thrust angle on it. The thrust angle was way too shallow, and every time you hit the throttle, it would nose down. Every time that you launched it, it wanted to nose down. So you had to be on the elevator right away when you launched it. So there will be a link in the show notes to the tutorial and the playlist for this plane, the tutorial that I made for modifying the thrust angle on it. Like I said, from what I understand, they have fixed that bad thrust angle. But I don't know if it has enough angle to it to allow for an 8-inch prop, because this plane came with a 7x5, and with the stock thrust angle, I certainly didn't have space for an 8-inch prop. After I made that mod, I have more than enough room for an 8-inch prop. I fly it with an 8x4. I've got an 8x3/8 on here that I've been doing testing with, but so far I think the 8x4 ABC style composite two-blade prop is the best prop for this plane that I've used so far. It gives it about a 1.3 to 1 thrust to weight ratio. This plane has so little drag in the air, that amount of that thrust to weight ratio really pushes it through the air really well. I've got this plane all set up and flying exactly how I want it, even with the amount of 100% throttle that I'm putting into it, doing aerobatics and spending probably the majority of the time between 60 to 70% throttle. I should, with a 3S 2200mm 25C LiPo, I should be able to get about 12 minutes of flight time out of this plane, not pulling the cells of the LiPo down below 3.5 volts. If you're just cruising around, you should be able to get 15 minutes of flight time on this plane. It's very stable, it's very forgiving, it's very maneuverable, and it's one of those planes that I think is an excellent value. It's another one of the factory planes that's one of my favorites. Don't know why I've neglected it for so long, but I've been putting a lot of flights on it now. I've got everything set up exactly how I want. In the show notes, I will have links to PDF files, my setup on the Ranger G2 as well as the fun Cub 1100. Those are my final setups for those planes, and it makes a very good aerobatic flight with that setup as well. So another excellent plane, factory plane that I have flown. Next up. Okay, the Blue & Fleister's F-22 Nano version 1. I have a lot of fun with this little tiny Parkjet. It's so small and it's so light. It runs off of a 1S brushless power system. We had wind the other morning of just 3 to 4 miles an hour, so I decided to take it out and I put 6 battery packs through it. I may have posted a couple of the flights already. I may not have. If not, they'll be coming up soon. But it's a lot of fun with the 1S power system. You can do loops and rolls and split S maneuvers with it. And you can fly it very, very slow because it's so lightweight. But it certainly doesn't rip up the sky like its big brothers with the 1S power system. So this has the Happy Model 1102 13,500 kV motor on it, and it's spinning a 65 by 65 millimeter prop. I think that's 2.5 inch diameter and a 2.5 inch pitch, if I'm not mistaken. So I think what I'm going to do is I think I'm going to convert this to a 2S power system. The motor says it's rated for a 2S to 3S. I don't think I would want to put a 3S on a 13,500 kV motor, but we'll see how well it works with a 2S power system. With some little 300mm 2S LiPos, the ones I use in my converted chuck glider, should provide enough weight to get the balance and everything correct. Once I add a voltage regulator to it, I'm going to keep the receiver and the servos the same. I'm just going to add a switching voltage regulator to provide 1S power to the receiver and the servos because they're low voltage components, while supplying 2S power to the ESC and the motor. And then we'll see what this little tiny thing does in the air when it's got a 2S power system in it instead of a 1S power system. But I'm betting it's going to go vertical just like its big brothers do, the Micro and the Mini. One other thing that I wanted to tell you about is on the V761 protocol. If you're using one of the multi-protocol transmitters, I have the Radio Master TX16S that I use to fly the Volantex Sport Cub 500, the Eachine Mini P51D Mustang, and the Eachine F4U Corsair. They all use, I think, the same basic electronics. They all use the V761 protocol if you're using a multi-protocol transmitter. I was out flying the F4U. I think I was testing out aileron extensions that I had installed on it to get a better roll rate. But I had to put some trim into the transmitter and I transferred that to sub trim. And then I hooked up the battery, bound up to the plane. The servos were working fine, but I could not arm the motor. The motor would not spin. I thought, what is going on? I thought maybe the built-in brush speed controller and the receiver brick, maybe it went bad. Maybe I've got a bad wire connection. But I was thinking to myself, because I'd already put several flights on it, and I was thinking, what did I do between the last flight and this flight? And then I remembered I had transferred trim to sub trim. So I went into the sub trim, and the amount of clicks of sub trim that were transferred was 8.5 clicks. So just to test that theory, I lowered the amount of sub trim to like 6, from 8.5 to 6. I bound back up to the plane, and lo and behold, the motor was working. And I thought that can't be what was causing the problem. Trim in the transmitter was causing the problem with the motor not spinning. So I just discounted it. I thought it's got to be a coincidence. You know, maybe the motor was hot. You know, maybe the receiver was hot. Maybe it just needed to cool down a little bit. So I went on and I finished my flight session. And then a couple of flight sessions later, I was doing the same thing. I was putting some trim into the transmitter, and then I transferred up to sub trim. I bound up to the plane, everything was working, but the motor wouldn't work. So I remembered that from the previous issue. So I went back in and I checked it. I removed the sub trim, bound the plane back up, all of a sudden the motor's working again. So I don't think this has anything to do with the V761 protocol. I think it has to do with the firmware in the gyro. So if you are using one of those multi-protocol transmitters, and for some reason you cannot get the motor to arm, you can't get the motor to spin, go into your transmitter, you know, make a mental note of how much trim you have in there, but remove your trim and then try it again. Because at that point I was convinced that was definitely the issue. That wasn't a coincidence, you know. For that happening exactly the same way the second time, that gyro is not arming the motor, apparently, if it detects too much sub trim. It doesn't seem to do that with regular trim in the transmitter. It just seems to do it with sub trim. So now I make sure that I mechanically trim it so that I only have to have a couple of clicks of sub trim in the transmitter, and I haven't had that problem since. So there's a tip for you on troubleshooting that issue if you ever run into it. But anyway, thank you for watching. Like I said, those setup files are links to the setup files are in the show notes of the video. Look for a lot more flights on those. Look for me taking this out before too long with the 2S power setup on it. I am really anxious to see how this thing screams through the air with 2S power on it. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the air.